So the first country I went to as a sociologist was a place called Zambia in Africa. And I worked, actually in that context, I was working officially in the mining industry as management. I was trying to figure out how it was that the mining companies, copper industry, how they were, multinational corporations were responding to independence. I was there from 1968 to 1972, 4 years after Zambia became an independent country, free of British colonialism. Well, free of formal colonialism. And I discovered exactly how the multinational corporations were working together with government and reproducing the racial order in the mining industry that I thought would disappear. After I left Zambia in 1972, a relatively rich African country became poorer and poorer. Why? Because the price of copper fell and fell and fell through the 1970s, through the 1980s. Zambia became indebted to Western donors, then the IMF imposed structural adjustments, displacement of workers, privatization, the actual currency was auctioned, there was degradation and poverty throughout the country, and then they were forced to do what? Privatize the one thing that they had owned publicly, the mines. They privatized the mines, 1997, reluctantly under pressure from the IMF. It took them 3 years dragging their feet, but the price of copper was so low that they basically had to give the mines away to multinational corporations from India, from Canada, from South Africa. So by 2001, the mines are privatized. And then what happens?
Prices went up.
Brilliant! You understand how capitalism works.
Yes.
Then the prices shot up. And so these multinational corporations made enormous amount of money. And the Zambian government didn't. This is the tragedy of a dependent country dependent upon copper. Anyway, that's the first story. After I left, disaster swept through Zambia. And then I went to South Chicago, and Joseph was talking about that story. Interesting story. I was working there as a machine operator in a factory producing diesel engines for construction equipment. I am, by the way, an incompetent worker. I am, when you watch me work, you say, oh my God, don't, because people can't bear to watch because I am so incompetent. And actually, not only am I incompetent, but I endanger my fellow workers. They really do. And the fact that I am still alive and have not killed any workers as a result of my incompetence is extraordinary miracle. God must be on my side. Anyway, it's very interesting how in different countries people respond to incompetence. Fascinating. In Chicago, they wanted to have nothing to do with me. Anyway, so
in the Philippines, they get to be voted.
They get to be voted into power. Aha. They'll be promoted. Aha. Nobody wanted to promote me. I was beyond promotion. Yeah, right. Anyway, the point is, I worked there, and basically I was studying a system of industrial relations. I called it, in a sense, I called it a fancy name, hegemonic, but we don't need to use that word. Basically, it was a relatively harmonious system of industrial relations, of collective bargaining, grievance machinery. I left. What happened? Basically, the industry that I thought would be perpetuated declined. It went bankrupt. And the whole of South Chicago, where I worked, which was the industrial heartland of the United States, became de-industrialized. So the whole manufacturing plants, steel industry, collapsed in South Chicago. And South Chicago became an industrial wasteland. It was basically warehousing for African Americans who were displaced from their housing because the middle classes of Chicago wanted to appropriate their housing projects for real estate investment and building new areas. So the African Americans, blacks, were displaced and dumped into this now deindustrialized area. And that followed quickly after I left. Then I went, interested in what is the difference between capitalism and socialism. I decided I would go to a socialist country and become a worker. Now this was a very difficult thing to accomplish because socialist countries don't really like to have foreigners there at all, never mind those working in the factory. Because in socialist countries, and I went eventually, well, my dream was to go to Poland, because in 1980-81, you know what happened in 1981 in Poland? The Solidarity Movement, very good. Working Solidarity Movement, it was perhaps the first societal-wide working-class revolution, 1980-81. But it was against state socialism, against a society that represented itself as the workers' society. But what was funnily enough, when I experienced this in Hungary, because I couldn't get into Poland, you see, we academics are very slow off our feet. So by the time I had packed my bags, got sabbatical, there was no solidarity movement in Poland. There was martial law. Jaruzelski took power, and I was not able to get into Poland, so I went to Hungary, and I managed to actually start working in factories in Hungary. You'll be pleased to know that I started in a champagne factory, which is a very good place to begin. Okay. You are laughing, but you're wrong. We don't drink champagne in a champagne factory. We workers drink beer or cognac. Ah, yes. Yeah, anyway. That's right. It's interesting. In Hungary, the workers loved my incompetence because they would actually help me figure out how to work because they wanted to talk to me about the United States of America. Yeah, that wonderful place that they had heard of through all their relatives. Anyway, there I was working in Hungary, and I worked there from 1982 to 89. I worked in a machine shop like the one in South Chicago, and I discovered that socialist factories can be efficient or even more efficient than the ones in South Chicago. And then, of course, then I actually worked in a steel mill for 3 years, but not overall it was just for 1 year, but in 3 years, in the times I could escape from the university, I would work in the factory in Hungary, 88, 89, and then what happens? 89, no more. Is there any socialist Hungary? The whole of Eastern Europe actually moves from a state socialist regime to a capitalist one. Now, I had dreamt that the state socialism would lead to a democratic socialism, but my dream didn't come true, and actually people embraced capitalism. You've got to understand that the working class in Hungary was told that socialism was this wonderful thing. It was efficient, it was just, and it was egalitarian. And everywhere the workers saw injustice, inefficiency, and inequality. And so they were very critical of the regime, and when capitalism became a possibility, they went along with it. And of course they soon regretted it, because Hungary, the steel mills where I worked, they disappeared, just like the steel mills in South Chicago. Again, what happens is I work there, and after I finish working, only disaster. So then I go to the Soviet Union. This is 1989, 1990. Actually, I get a job in the Soviet Union in 1990.
I know where this is going.
Yeah. In 1990, well, that's the first time I'm wandering down the Volga River on a boat. In 1991 was actually when I get the first job in a rubber factory in Moscow, and then later in that year, April, May, June, July, I get a job in a furniture factory, again drilling holes. I'm always drilling holes wherever I go. And that was very interesting. Oh, those Russian workers, they didn't want to talk to me. Who is this guy? This American guy? He's going up to the north in a closed city, a city that didn't allow foreigners to enter. I have managed to get in there, managed to get a job. Who is this? He must be the CIA agent, right? What else could he be? American professor. I mean, no professor works in factories in Russia. That's a crazy idea. And Americans, they are really crazy. So nobody, and they did not like my incompetence either. You know, the funny story is, some of you may appreciate this, the real story of why my fellow workers really took a dislike to me in the beginning, because it turned out that the first level supervisor would tell the workers, you must come to work on time. There is an American watching you. So they really did not love this American visitor. Anyway, so I worked there for 2 or 3 months, and then I left in July, and then became, in a sense, a major sort of hero of the opposition to the Soviet Union. And by the end of the year, there was no Soviet Union. It collapsed. And my fellow workers were the ones who were first to be sacrificed, together with the mine workers that I also had been studying. So yes. So there's the story. So you see, my friends tell me, my leftist friends say, Michael, wherever you go, disaster follows you. You are trouble. Basically, the simple story is that beginning in the 1970s, we have experienced a wave of marketization, of unregulated capitalism that actually speeds across the world. Across the world. And that's what Joseph was already telling us. And this tsunami of marketization is amazing in its capacity to destroy all that is in its way. And that seems to me a central feature that probably we all share, that explains why the labor movement faces such extremely difficult odds everywhere in the world. In the United States, the labor movement shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. We are down to now 7% unionization in the private sector. And they are now going after the public sector workers. And the question is whether those public sector unions will survive. And it's touch and go, and of course what happens in the election will have some bearing upon that. But it's not something that, whether it's Romney or Obama, capitalism has its own capacity to transmit itself, not just in the private sector, but in the